Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Ideas, the monthly Marxist podcast from Socialist Alternative. In this episode, we'll be asking how should socialists approach the question of national oppression? From the Kurds in the Middle East to the Uyghur minority that suffered racist oppression at the hands of the dictatorship in China, this question is central for all of those fighting for a world free from capitalism. Nowhere is this question more pronounced than in Israel-Palestine, where our co-thinkers, Socialist Struggle movement, as part of the International Socialist Alternative, are organising against the oppression of the Palestinians and for workers' unity across borders. But what are the challenges facing socialists in that part of the world? We have a speaker from Socialist Struggle, Tuvaal Klein, and to introduce her, I will pass over to Yara Cliff.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Revolutionary Ideas, the podcast from Socialist Alternative. This time we're going to discuss Israel-Palestine, and we're going to talk about the national question there and also how socialist activists are actually working on the ground there in this highly volatile environment and what they're putting forward. And for that purpose, we're joined today with Tuvaal Klein, who is a member of Socialist Alternative's sister organisation in Israel and Palestine, which is called Socialist Struggle. Tuvaal has been a socialist activist in Israel and Palestine for the last decade or so, and she's also a member of Tel Aviv University's Students for Climate, so she's done a lot of student work as well, which I think would be really interesting.
So I'm going to give you a very, very difficult task to start with, Tuvaal, and I'm going to ask you to give us a quick run-through of the political situation in Israel-Palestine, if you think you can do that.
Well, can I? I mean, I think 2 hours wouldn't be enough to do that. The situation is really complicated. When the national question is, of course, a major concern. However, as the basis for the formation of the Israeli state was around a Jewish state that would be a so-called safe haven for Jewish people everywhere, there are many other ethnic groups like Jewish Russian speakers, Jewish people from Ethiopian descent, Jewish people from Arab descent that also experience oppression. And in general, the Israeli working class in itself is poor. It suffers from bad living conditions, of course, not similar to the terrible situation of Palestinians that live in the occupied West Bank or besieged Gaza, but it's also not easy. The high cost of living, housing crisis, things that I think will probably be familiar to people in the UK as well. And I can't really go into the whole history of the region, but needless to say that Western imperialism and colonialism have taken their toll on the whole of the Middle East and the area of Israel-Palestine included, and the terrible consequences of the formation of the State of Israel. So the Nakba, which is the catastrophe of the Palestinian people, the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes that to this day live in refugee camps in Gaza and the West Bank, as well as in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Most of Jewish Israelis today do not have another citizenship at the same time. I mean, they speak Hebrew as a mother tongue. This is their home. So it's a very complicated situation, and the fight to end the bloodshed and the oppression of Palestinians, for that reason, has to be able to provide a solution that will address the needs of both of these groups.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I also think that because of how capitalism works and how it's kind of there to maintain the interests of the ruling class, the interests of profit, rather than the interests of actual working people, like you said, I think they don't really have an interest in solving this conflict, do they? Like, they're benefiting from it. We see the oppression. Like, I know it's very kind of trendy to say that all Israelis are benefiting from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but the truth is that some people are benefiting from it, which is the ruling class in Israel. But working people in Israel are not actually benefiting from it. And I think the role of capitalism in there is very, very clear. And like you say, the only way to actually solve it is to be democratic about it. And the only way to be democratic about it is to have the control of the working class over those decisions. And I was wondering, because Mavak Socialisti have been around for a couple of decades now, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what you and the organization are doing in Israel-Palestine. Well, what are the kind of things that you're pushing for? What kind of campaigns you're involved in?
So, of course, we're involved in the fight against occupation, siege, and all types of racism. But as I mentioned before, it's not the only form of injustice or racism that people here experience, the racism against Palestinians. And our main mission is to build a socialist force of both Jewish and Palestinian people that can end all of these oppressions, whether it be police brutality towards Jewish people of Ethiopian descent, which, also Palestinians that live inside Israel experience. It's different groups that experience this, but they both suffer from maybe not the same, but similar kind of oppressions, and also gender and LGBTQ violence and discrimination, or other types of oppression, like, exploitation of the environment. And so what we do is we try to link between these struggles to say that these differing forms of exploitation and oppression have something in common. They're aimed first and foremost towards the working class on both sides of the national divide. And they're implemented by the Israeli regime, who serves the interests of a narrow elite. And we're trying to build a force that is able to combine, these struggles and kind of give it a working class basis and explain that it's not, that it's the same government that's doing all these things, and it's because that's their agenda, to promote this different types of oppression, to make sure that there's this hierarchy where maybe you're supposed to be thankful that you're not under siege or whatever, but you're still struggling to make ends meet. And so, to fight capitalism, we need to unite as working people. So that means both Jewish people and Palestinian people, and our activity in general reflects this idea. And I want to give an example, a concrete example. So when a Palestinian worker worked in a supermarket, he was beaten up by sort of a police force, a few people that were out of uniform outside a shop in central Tel Aviv. And what we did is, after this happened, we made the connection to the wider struggle against police brutality, and we organized a protest and invited the family of a young man from Jewish Ethiopian descent who was murdered by police. And so these are two groups that usually don't fight alongside each other because of the national divide and all of these different complications, but this was for us very important, and we think that these links are very important to create because they reveal the way that the capitalist system works, based on exploiting all of us and dividing and ruling for profit.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point, especially because, a lot of the questions that we often get are to do with, you're a bit too naive if you think that Israelis and Palestinians are going to work together. And I think that those kind of struggles show, like this one and ones that, to do with housing in certain mixed neighborhoods or in factories where there are both Jewish and Palestinian workers. Those kind of struggles show that through struggle, you can find the commonality. And you can see that even if you look at the kind of national divide, which is really deep, and nobody's saying that it's going to be easy, you can still fight together, and you can still find those points of contact that kind of, I'm sure the people that were involved in this struggle kind of have a new perspective on how to fight together.
Yeah, actually, the example that I usually give when talking to, mostly Jewish Israelis that I meet in Tel Aviv and the area, the example that I usually give is of a factory in Haifa, which is a mixed city in the north of Israel. It's called Haifa Chemicals, and there were Jewish and Palestinian workers fighting side by side for their rights. And the Jewish workers were quite right-wing. I mean, they were avid Likud voters. Likud is Netanyahu's party. And they ended up fighting for the Palestinian workers who were on like a lower pay grade, a lower grade or level or whatever. And because they realized that this basically allows the management to drive down all of the working conditions in the factory. And so they were fighting alongside each other. They were still right-wing. They weren't convinced on the ideas of socialism. But after 6 months, this was one of the longest strikes, I think, in Israel, or at least at the time. And after 6 months, some of them did move to the left, or at least were convinced on certain points. And I think that this shows how the kind of united common consciousness that you develop during a working people's struggle, something that definitely has potential, especially in an area that is so divided, like the Middle East, specifically Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, and I think that's super inspirational as well to see that, because obviously the national divide in Israel and Palestine is deep. Nobody is claiming otherwise. And I think that, we always talk about, like, in kind of like Marxist circles, how consciousness shifts with the objective situation. And we see that, and, during worker struggles in the UK as well, people's consciousness moves forward when they see how management deals with the issues, when they see how society is built through their struggle. And I think that also applies to any other type of oppression. When you experience it, when you see kind of the common ground that you have, it's stronger than the national divide at the end of the day. But I think these are obviously really inspirational points and like things that have happened, but I'm sure that working and being an activist in a place so divided like Israel-Palestine is going to bring a lot of obstacles and a lot of struggles. And I was wondering if you kind of can tell us a little bit about how, like, those kind of struggles that you have as a socialist activist in a country like Israel-Palestine.
Okay, so I will answer your question, but first I do have to say that I always feel a bit uncomfortable saying this, because for Palestinian activists, whether it be in the occupied territories or Palestinians that live in Israel, I mean, it's much more difficult, the levels of violence that you experience, and I mean, it's different to what I experienced. But I do have to say that being a leftist in Israel, a socialist, is difficult. Opposing the occupation here is difficult. There's lots of incitement against the left. And it's very weak, not to mention the socialist left, which is practically inexistent. It's very different here than in protests in the UK, where you would have quite a few socialist organizations from different trends trying to sell their paper. I mean, here it's not really like that. But also another thing is that in general, like in society, there's very low class consciousness, where in a society where the ethnic oppressions are so diverse as well. I mean, the way that people usually identify themselves is first by like where they're from, and only after that people don't really identify themselves as working class, at least not like they do in the UK. And I think that there's also a lack of anti-capitalist awareness, which makes it hard to build on, like, towards socialist consciousness. And I think that the history of working people's struggles, it's not the same as in Europe. And I think that also that the kind of artificial divide that is drawn by some activists as well between issues makes it difficult. It's like an apolitical mood amongst some leftist activists that feel this incitement and hatred among society and think that the best way of tackling this is to just pretend like issues like the occupation don't exist, and that it should be like a single issue struggle. So that's also quite hard.
Yeah, and I think the biggest kind of social movement, like in 2011, was a really good indication. So in 2011, there were hundreds of thousands on the streets protesting every single day. And I think then it was very, very clear how kind of ignoring those issues of the national conflict is just not going to work for the left, because it created an even deeper divide between the Jewish working class. Like these were working class struggles, mainly brought on by the housing crisis in Israel. And it's just, this is an issue that also relates to Palestinians, but you barely saw any Palestinians going on the streets, even though those were mass struggles and on a level that hasn't been seen before in Israel or Palestine. And it just kind of highlights how only this kind of united struggle of the working class across the region can win actual points, because the struggle was kind of pushed away with issues of national conflict as well. And I think this brings me on to the next question that I have. That I'm sure that you've heard about the question of kind of anti-Semitism, and that's been in the headlines in Britain for quite a few years, since Corbyn became the leader of the Labour Party in 2015. And specifically, I think that it started a debate on whether criticizing the state of Israel and its actions against the Palestinians, whether the act of criticizing the state of Israel is in itself anti-Semitism. And I want to hear your thoughts about that. And also, it would be interesting to know if this was in the headlines in Israel as well, in regards to Corbyn.
Yeah, it's quite funny, actually. I mean, my dad, for example, would say things like, "Oh yeah, Corbyn, he's a great anti-Semite," and I'd ask him, I mean, why do you think that? And he'd just say, "Well, it was on the news, Yeah, the media here loved that story because it builds on this narrative where everybody is anti-Semitic abroad, and they're just, they're just criticizing us because they hate Jewish people. And it kind of, in a way, it helped strengthen the government's propaganda, where it's like, yeah, we're defending the Jewish people against all the haters or whatever. So it's quite problematic, especially because I think that the allegations against Corbyn were completely unbased, and it seems like, I'm sure the Labour Party isn't separated from society, and so I'm sure that there's many issues of racism there as well as anti-Semitism, but I really don't think that was the way to address it. And in general, this idea that you can't criticize the state of Israel because that's anti-Semitism, I'm sure that you get that a lot, being an Israeli Jewish person living in Europe. But I was talking before about incitement against the left in Israel and against people who criticize the occupation. And I think that this idea that you can't criticize what the Israeli government is doing, that's hurting us as activists who are really isolated. And these actions of solidarity, they're important. They're important both for Palestinians and Jewish people that are fighting against the occupation. And so, I do think that the Israeli government needs to be criticized. And I think that it can be done. Its actions are criminal. They're endangering my life. They're endangering my friends and families' lives, not only the people in Gaza who are obviously, especially now around the coronavirus crisis, I can't even imagine what kind of suffering, but still, it needs to be addressed that the Israeli government isn't hurting only Palestinians, it's also hurting Jewish people. So definitely I think that it's a good thing that there's these acts of solidarity abroad with the Palestinian people. To me, I see that as acts of solidarity with me as well, as leftist activist, socialist.
I think that's a really, really important point, and a really interesting one as well. I think that's something that's kind of slipping away when we talk about anti-Semitism here in the UK, because I think it's very easy, and I feel like maybe that's a bit controversial, but I think that in itself is bordering on anti-Semitic to just assume that all the Jewish people are going to support the state of Israel and all the Jewish people are going to be Zionists, because we know that that's not true. We know that there's activists like you, like me, like our organization in Israel-Palestine, but not just us, who are fighting and who are Israeli or Jewish around the world, who are fighting against the policies of the Israeli government, fighting against any capitalist government around the world that are oppressing workers and oppressing people based on national divides, but also otherwise. And I think that's also really important to say that, like, if we're saying, which obviously the definition of anti-Semitism that was put forward, and that Corbyn and the Labour Party was so kind of witch hunted about, as one that was supported and pushed for by the Israeli government, and that is obviously it's kind of obvious why they would do that, because it gives them the right to call anyone who disagrees with them on a political level anti-Semitic, and that includes Israeli and Jewish activists like yourself.
I'm also anti-Semitic. You don't get it.
yeah, self-hating Jew, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's that's actually a really good point. Like, even Sanders in the US was called anti-Semitic despite the fact that he is in fact Jewish and his parents escaped Nazi Germany. Because if
you're not our kind of Jewish, then you're not really Jewish, are you?
Yeah, and it's a right-wing propaganda rather than an actual attempt to address anti-Semitism that definitely exists in every party, but to be fair, mostly on the right, which is generally more racist. But you don't hear the media.
Yeah, by the way, I mean, like Netanyahu is friends with all the neo-Nazis, all the anti-Semites, just, you can't get enough of it, and nobody's criticizing him for it. But these are people that actually started anti-Semitic campaigns like Orban against George Soros and stuff like that. I mean, no, it's just ridiculous, really.
So I wanted to ask you on kind of like maybe a more theoretical question on the position that socialists should and have taken to the national conflict or national question in Israel-Palestine. And I was wondering, if we're talking about that national question, do we support a Palestinian state? And if so, why do we do that? Because as socialists, we are nationalists. We don't support borders. So I want to know what you think about that.
I think that as socialists, we don't support borders. I mean, we believe in a world without borders, and that's what we're fighting for in the long term. But Palestinians right now are suffering from oppression stemming from the fact that they do not have their own state, and they're fighting to have the right to national determination. And they're fighting to be able to achieve their rights, like the right to return, like the right for decent housing, decent living conditions, things like that as well. And these all fall under the fact that right now they live in refugee camps and are refused the right to determine themselves and the right to govern themselves. And so that's why we support a Palestinian state, and we support the Palestinian struggle, and we believe that it's crucial to be able to achieve liberation for the Palestinian masses in order to achieve socialism in the region, also in Israel. And the thing is that we won't be able to achieve socialism without solving the national conflict, but we won't be able to solve the national conflict without without building socialist forces that offer a political program that can arm both Jewish and Palestinian masses with the way forward, how to achieve, peace, but also prosperity and good education and healthcare and welfare and all of these things.
So I really agree with that. But also think this brings me on to another important question, the annexation plan that has been talked about a lot, I think, in the news. And I wanted to know, first of all, what does it even mean? How is it different to the situation right now?
We're talking about the annexation now. It's important to say that in a few hours' time, the situation could be completely different. It could change. We've been getting these updates about the annexation the past few days and weeks. It's important to say that even now, as we speak, I don't think that even Netanyahu himself knows exactly what he wants. And it's important because people also here in Israel, Jewish people as well, who hear this propaganda all the time, are not sure what is this plan, what is an annexation. What Netanyahu has said, he has said that he will not give citizenship to Palestinians that are being that live in annexed areas, which basically means that the current situation of apartheid and colonial rule of the West Bank will continue, but in a formal way. So the annexation is a very, very dangerous plan that we have to oppose, and there has already started a coalition of organizations against the annexation, which led a protest last week, which we participated in, both Jewish people and Palestinian people, and there are plans for a continuation of the struggle, which will be involved in, and it's very important for us at this stage to make sure that within Israel there is as much resistance to this plan as possible, because this could, such an unstable government will have problems implementing such a plan if there is serious resistance on the ground. So it's one of our missions for the next weeks.
And I think those protests that you talked about were really big and really inspiring, I think, especially in the context of coronavirus. And I think we've had protests all around the world on different subjects. But I think this one in particular was really inspiring because, this question of the annexation didn't come out of nowhere, did it? Like, why do you think this is the time that Netanyahu is speaking about this?
So it's a serious question. I'm not going to pretend that I have all the answers, because I do think that this plan has been opposed and resisted by various forces, not only on the left and not only by socialists, but also forces from Netanyahu's regime or from the ruling class in general that have opposed this for different reasons. So you do have a right-wing resistance to this, because the right-wing settler organizations are so fanatical that they refuse the puppet state that is offered to the Palestinians is called a state. And despite having absolutely no autonomy, no control of the borders, no ability to defend itself, nothing. But they refuse, they oppose the plan because they refuse to let Palestinians have anything that is called a state. Netanyahu has tried to convince them by saying, we'll call it a state. It won't be one. But so there's that. There's also obviously the forces within the ruling class that realize that this is a real problem for them, because it might ignite mass resistance. And we've seen the protests in Lebanon as well. And we've seen what even regimes in the area have been pushed into, because they can't possibly accept that they have their own problems within the Jordanian regime. They can't, they have millions of Palestinians living within Jordan, and they can't just allow it to, they don't care about the Palestinians, but they can't allow it to just to happen. So they've said that they will cancel the peace agreement with Israel, which is a serious issue for the ruling class as well. and also the Sunni regimes that Israel has had secret, but not so secret, ties with. Over the last few years have said that this will jeopardize their relationship that was built with them. So that's also an issue for the ruling class. And then obviously you have working class Israelis that realize that this is really dangerous and that Netanyahu is leading us into a situation where, you know, I mean, it's like Netanyahu is leading us to a situation where we would suffer severely from the consequences, because this is not a peace plan. This is a war plan. He's going to ignite the whole area. So, yeah, there are many Jewish Israelis that want to fight alongside Palestinians to make sure that this doesn't happen. And that's what we believe, is that only the masses have the power to really stop this. We should not rely on these liberal forces in the ruling class or whatever. Their reasoning is different to ours. We support working class interests, but we don't care about their business interests and the oil and fighting Iran and all of that. So, yeah.
So yeah, I think I completely agree with that. And I think it's also, you know, because of how right now we have a certain situation on the ground and there's a kind of animosity, even though the working class is one international working class, no matter where it is, there's still this animosity that exists between the Israeli working class and the Palestinian working class. And it's completely understandable because both of those working class areas have been under attack for so long and have had the divide and rule tactics on them for so long. It makes sense, and especially with this bloody conflict that has had real, tangible, violent effects on both the Israeli working class and the Palestinian working class. So obviously we want to connect between the working classes. And I think that if there was a situation where, you know, the Israeli working class and the Palestinian working class found kind of the unity that's needed, would you still think that we need a separate Palestinian state?
So I think that part of what we're building, part of a political program, is that these things are dynamic, that movements erupt, and we've seen that happen with the Black Lives Matter movement, which has swept the entire world, basically, including the UK, all continents. And so we know that consciousness can change during struggle. So yes, I mean, if the consciousness changes and if we see that the demands change and that Palestinian and Jewish people are actually bridging the gap that exists nowadays, and then I think that we'll have to update our program, which we do all the time. And in such a situation, possibly a one-state solution could be the better way to move forward towards a federation of the Middle East, and you know, a Middle East with no borders and no national conflicts and all of that. But right now, the situation is that to bridge over this animosity, this is what we need to build and gain trust. To make sure that Palestinians are able to achieve their demands and their rights, but at the same time to make sure that we reach out to the Jewish Israeli masses and explain to them why they should support, in fact, the Palestinian struggle, and why it's actually in their best interests to support it. And this is our task, and it's not an easy one, but that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think a really important point that you made is that we don't stop there. We don't just say we need a Palestinian state and that's it, that all of the problems are going to be solved. Because even for, like you said, even for the Israeli Jewish working class, there's still a lot of issues under an Israeli state, because the state is a capitalist state. And yes, the capitalist system uses those national divides, those ethnic divides, and all of the other plenty of divides that exist, especially in Israel and Palestine, but all over the world. The capitalist class uses them to their own interest and to lower wages, to create divides that actually hurt the working class all over the world. But so just creating a Palestinian state is not going to solve it. It has to be a socialist state. It has to be a socialist state right next to an Israeli socialist state. And only from that can we build this federation of the Middle East and bridge over this animosity.
Definitely, I completely agree. And I also want to add that I think that it's not just that capitalism feeds off of the national conflict and its ability to use it to divide and rule. It's also incapable of solving it. And so some sections, as I said before, some sections of the capitalist ruling class actually would like to solve the conflict in a way where there is a puppet Palestinian state, or maybe with less or more authority and autonomy, but basically still a subjugated state, subjugated economically and politically, and it's not within their powers to reach a peace agreement that actually fulfills Palestinians' demands because of many reasons, one of which is their lack of ability to, Palestinians demand the right to return. And so that means that they will need to build lots of public housing, but that's not going to happen under this current government. They don't even build public housing for Jewish people, which they, they prefer. Not prefer, they discriminate against whoever is not Jewish, but they also don't provide Jewish working class people's needs. So and so there's that, but there's also the demographic issue where, like you said before, people in the ruling class, they don't want Palestinians to have the right to vote because, what will happen then? How will they secure power? So there's all these issues, there's many more, but
So, I want to ask you, because we talked a lot about the power of international solidarity and how the working class is one working class in Israel or Palestine or the UK. And I know that a lot of activists here in the UK really want to find ways to help. And a lot of them go to the boycott and divestment kind of BDS movement. And I want to ask you, what do you think about the BDS movement and what is effective solidarity?
So I don't think it's a black and white question or answer, but we as socialists support certain boycotting campaigns, such as boycotting the settlements, which is a campaign that also exists in Israel. There used to be a time where it was very popular, this campaign. Now it's not as much because there are other issues such as the struggle against the annexation, which we've discussed, and stuff like that. But still, we do support certain boycotts. We do not support, like a blanket boycott or however you say it, of like boycotting everything that comes from Israel, boycotting academia and stuff like that. Why? Because we believe that it stems from a wrong analysis of how the apartheid in South Africa ended. We believe that in the unique sort of political climate within Israel, where Jewish people, despite being the oppressor despite being on the side of the oppressor for many years, have this consciousness, have this idea of what happened during the Holocaust and of anti-Semitism. You've seen that in the UK, the influences of this sort of consciousness, because Jewish people were prosecuted for thousands of years, and because of the horrors of the Holocaust. Jewish people in Israel are scared, and we believe that the promoting like a blanket boycott kind of drives them into the arms of Netanyahu and the right, which say, people abroad, they're all anti-Semites, they hate us, this is why we need Israel, a strong state and a strong army. And for us, we think that it complicates the issue. And so I think that solidarity protests and vigils and marches with Palestinian people are very much seen here and felt here. And as leftists in Israel, obviously it's not the same as fighting the occupation in the West Bank or in Gaza, but it's not an easy atmosphere for leftists in Israel either. And we've had, members who were physically beaten, demonstrations and stuff. And so these solidarity protests with Palestinians are also something for us to get inspiration from and feel the solidarity. But we believe that the real key for solving the conflict is mass struggle here, which is why we're building our forces here. We also believe that the wide mass movements around the world have an influence, and I think that the Black Lives Matter protests proved this. They proved how much power one mass movement in one country can have, and that's what can really help here. As socialists in the UK, building your forces, working towards solidarity with Palestinians, but also working towards building a mass movement against capitalism, against imperialism, against racism, against Islamophobia in the UK is something that can really, really help us. And I think that's one of the main things that can drive real change here in the Middle East.
Yeah, and I think those are really, really good points, especially because I think you mentioned a little bit about kind of the analysis of the fall of apartheid in South Africa. And I think that there's a major difference that people sometimes ignore, that in South Africa, the Black communities, the majority of the people. In Israel and Palestine, Palestinians aren't the majority. Jewish Israelis are. So if we want to kind of get to the position of liberation for Palestinian people, we kind of have to have the support of the Israeli working class as well. And I think that is something, obviously, it's something that's not going to be easy to do, but I think it can definitely happen with that international solidarity. When people fight against Islamophobia and also fight against anti-Semitism, when people show that it's not just, a decision made because people hate Jews or are persecuting Jews. It's because of an analysis of the way that the state of Israel, rather than the working class in Israel, are treating the Palestinians and also treating the working class in Israel itself. And that way, I completely agree that the left in Israel can feel very, very isolated. And seeing those solidarity protests and solidarity kind of symbols are really, really useful. But when you see them completely detached from the fight that you're fighting and the left in Israel is fighting, it kind of fails to make that connection of a united struggle with the Israeli working class and the Palestinian working class, which is essential for the liberation of Palestinian people.
Definitely, I agree. And I also want to say that the heroic struggle of the Black masses in South Africa, along with certain sections of the white working class there, was what achieved the end of apartheid. 100%. And here in Israel-Palestine, in the Middle East, we have to solve our own issues. We can't rely on European Union or European movements to solve our issues here. That's why we have to make sure that we continue on building our forces despite the difficulties, and make sure that we build a Jewish Palestinian force, people fighting together to end the occupation and the siege and the horrors of them. So, yeah.
Thank you to both of our speakers for that fantastic discussion, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please take that extra step and get involved with Socialist Alternative today. For our website, go to socialistalternative.net, go to Facebook and type Socialist Alternative ISA England, Wales and Scotland. On Instagram, we are socialistalternative.ews, and we also have TikTok, which is socialist_vids. Please make sure to follow and share us on all of these platforms. Please send our second episode again to your friends, family, workmates and so on. We hope to see you again soon on our next episode, which will be on the life and ideas of the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky. Thank you for tuning in. Take care.